Living Wish in 2024, the year of our Lord.
Next on Eternal Turtles.
This episode is supported by our Dirtle Maniacs, who enjoy ad-free content as well as bonus content that can be found either on Patreon, Spotify, or YouTube. If you're thinking about supporting the show, we'd really appreciate it, and you can find us on any of those mediums. What it do? Hello and welcome to Eternal Turtles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Dude, it's good. How do we feel about Mystery Booster having future sight frames and white borders coming back? And
it's all a cash grab, man. It's all a cash grab. It's trying to get those pre-modern players to come out of the woodwork.
Reprinting Sensei's top, still no retro frame top. No retro frame top exists, Zach.
Did they reprint Sensei's dividing top in this?
There's now a future sight top. There's no retro frame.
So rude.
Retro frame. How's there no retro frame?
Do you have altered tops?
I sold my altered tops back when they were banned.
Okay.
They were easy to move. I probably should have hung on to them, but I mean, if they were in my collection and then I just had them and know that I could never play them, I feel like I'd be sad. But, you know, now there's like straight up an infinite combo in Vintage that might be the way to go for Eternal Weekend.
What is that?
So Glaring Flesh Raker, which is one of the Eldrazi, which is like an exponentially progressive card in terms of like how it deals damage, which is stupid because it's an uncommon.
Yeah.
But you know how you would in old Legacy with top, you could do top spin top to pump your mentor and monks.
Sure.
Well, you can do that same thing with Glaring Fresh Raker, except you can just straight up go infinite without any extra mana.
With Forge, right?
No. You just top spin top, and then when you cast the top, you make an Eldrazi Scion, and then you deal them a damage, and then you flip it and do it again, and do it over and over again. So Glaring Flesh Raker.
So you just need two tops.
Two tops plus Glaring Flesh Raker is infinite.
Got it. I was like, how do you do the thing? Because you could also do it with Karn. With whatever, Mystic Forge? Yeah.
But you don't even need Mystic Forge to cast it off the top because
you see two tops
and draw themselves, and then Flesh Raker makes the mana for some reason. And
have to get top restricted in Vintage.
So I legitimately like I'm still missing some stuff to like actually play legitimately at Eternal Weekend in Vintage. Like I'm missing some power. Yeah. But if I can acquire it before then, I might just bust out like a mono blue because the colorless on Glaring Flesh Raker is free because you're already compelled to play 4 Wastelands and a Strip Mine plus 4 Urza Saga in that format. So you already have 9 colorless
swords. Got it. Yeah.
So it seems fairly trivial to actually be able to cast that thing. And then if you're in mono blue and get Ancient Tomb and, you know, all the other busted stuff that already is asking, the deck builds itself because Urza Saga is stupid. Yeah. And then you just can play like, I don't know, like if you need to be able to find 2 tops, then you can just play Trinket Mage or some shit.
Man, this is the deck you've been waiting for to make Urza Saga and Sensei's Dividing Top a thing so that you can no longer bitch about Urza Saga, huh? Eternal Turtles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
No. I'm going to bitch. I really do think that card is just so dumb. I think it's so dumb because it would be really nice if you could play a format that didn't compel you to play Wasteland. Like it would just be sure nice to not have to play Wasteland in order to be competitive, or Urza Saga. And they're just that's just not the case. But so Glaring Flesh Raker plus 2 tops might be how I win Eternal Weekend this year.
There we go. So you had texted me earlier this week about Living Wish, and you were talking about it in the context of my 4-color Draco Beanpack deck. And I was skeptical at first, but I kind of looked at it a little bit, and I was like, you know, if we can come up with a build that like optimizes Living Wish, like 4 of Living Wish. You know, I think the thing I was worried about with Living Wish was like, I don't want to just spend 2 mana to do what I was already doing, right? Like I don't want to just like, whoops, I paid two mana and now I can go get the thing I was probably going to do anyway. Like throw a Draco in my sideboard, and just get the things I was already going to do. I didn't want to do that. But having it as like a silver bullet effect, especially because as we've discussed several times, my nemesis in this deck is Blood Moon. Blood Moon ends me, Mags of the Moon, Harbinger of the Tides, however you want to do it, Contamination. All those cards just brick me. I can't play Magic against any of the cards that just say like your mana is useless, right? Because I'm a 5-color deck, and the way the layers work is that if I have out my Leyline of the Guild Pact and you play Blood Moon happens. Leyline of the Guild Pact is under that layer, basically, and it can't work until Blood Moon goes away, or until I play another Leyline of the Guild Pact. Spoiler alert, it's a 4-color card that needs 4 different colors of mana to be put into play. I'm never playing that card after a Blood Moon's in play. It's just not happening. So we were talking about Living Wish as a way to kind of create silver bullets in your main deck and after board, where you always have access to ways out of a lock like that. So playing Basic Force obviously is the first step there, because you need to be able to actually cast your Living Wish, and then we kind of need to think of ways to get rid of Harbinger of the Tide, Magus of the Moon, and Blood Moon, right? So of course you can go like what is it, Reclamation Sage or something like that, and do that. D2 Firewalker, I guess, is a card. I'm sure there's no. We came up with what Goblin Crater Maker is a better choice.
You also have Beseiju.
Beseiju, another great. Yeah, you can use lands, right?
I think the flexibility as a fellow control mage. Welcome to the dark side. As a fellow control mage, I think that there's just one thing that I've found is that because there are no longer really cards that you can ignore. So this all came about because I was watching. I'm going to tangent for a real quick second.
Yeah, go.
This all came about because I was watching old coverage for inspiration. I was looking at like what are old deck lists for miracles, like where was the slate, just like going back to the 101s. Like let me go back to the roots and get some clarity on different things. And I get it's all format contextual, but one of the things that I noticed that was pretty helpful, I think. And might be helpful for deck building in general. I mean, I often talk about ABC deck building theory, but one thing that I thought was interesting was I was watching old deck techs, and the context of deck techs, if you did them as a way to scrutinize your own builds amongst the people that you build decks with. So, for example, I have all of the different, variations of miracles that I play, and if we just literally did a deck tech of a build, and you brought up those cards and scrutinized me to like defend the rationale for those card choices in the numbers that they're there, that's a way to like really like sift through your card choices and get rid of any chafe that like might be convoluting your otherwise fairly efficient deck. And then while I was thinking about maybe deck tech technique essentially as a way to refine your card choices, I was thinking to myself, man, it also seems like deck building back then you could get away with a lot more, because not every single card that your opponent played was like a lights out must answer snowball or haymaker lights out card that disrupted you. It was back when people were still casting like Tarmogoyf, and it's like, okay, it's a vanilla creature that it's like, yes, it can be thick, but it's not anywhere near as thick as a Murktide Regent. And you can block it on the ground, right? So like the blocking mechanic was still relevant.
Yeah.
So like, Snapcaster and shit could like jump in the way and just gain you life in ways that just is non-existent now with everything having evasion or menace of some kind, right? So blocking is just entirely irrelevant. So, but in that world though, I was like, there were a bunch of cards that like didn't fully matter, right? Like you had to like deal with it at some point if your life total was under duress or whatever, but it wasn't like, I need to answer this or I die to it, right? Yeah. Like if they untap and connect with this thing, like I'm dead. And that just didn't exist in the same way back then as it does now. And so while I was looking at that, I was like, man, the way that your deck is confined for slots to like always have the answer in the moment that you need to have it is immediate, right? Like you don't have the same time. You don't get draw steps anymore. Like
no. Every threat is basically like damage plus like a time walk.
Yeah, it just feels like either you answer something or you die. Yeah. So the necessity to have either a way to rebound significantly from behind, like a huge way to come back from behind, which I think it struggles right now. Like you can't really do that. So I mean, you can't do that in a way that's meaningful, right? Like if you're playing from behind, like you somehow had one of those like big effects where your opponent didn't play around something. I don't know. I mean, I'm the
Terminus being a card, right? Yeah.
I'm literally playing from behind constantly, and it just it is an uphill battle, right? So that the notion of needing to have an answer immediately for everything at all times or die made me think, man, it would be really nice if you just had a density of always having whatever you needed whenever you needed it. And so that got me onto the idea of like tutors, right? Just having more effective copies of whatever you need when you need it. And when I was looking at tutors that are viable, I was like, man, it sure would be nice if, personal tutor was an instant, right? In which case you could find something. But then I got along and found Living Wish. And then I was like, well, I mean, you already play enough. Like I saw like 4-colored builds that were playing like some number of endurances in the board. And then they were playing like a Caracas on the board sometimes to protect their Uros or whatever. And I'm like, there's already a bunch of cards here that are lending themselves to Living Wish. And I was like, if you just moved over and played a basic forest instead of the other basics or in addition to or whatever, that means that you could open up and instead of having only 4 copies of Solitude, you could effectively have 7 copies of Solitude. And you could Living Wish for the Boseiju or the Bajukabog or the Endurance or the Solitude or the Fury or whatever you need. It essentially just represented at 2 mana all of these effects that are either free or cost nothing or cost relatively low mana investment. And so it's not like I remember when I brought it to you, you were like, well, I don't want to just tack on 2 mana to everything that I'm playing. And I'm like, well, your deck is built to have a 2 mana enchantment in play and then cast nothing but free spells for the rest of the game while you go up cards, right? So it's like, you having 2 mana for free spells is not necessarily the worst if that 2 mana means that you have an answer for whatever you want whenever you want it.
Yeah.
And then that functionally will then introduce that card that you brought in for the rest of the game, right? Like if you get Endurance, then you have Endurance. And it's like, I think that it's an area worth exploring because I found that I was like, man, I would really love to play all of these different effects for when I need them, to the point where I found that like right now, the build that I'm playing with Miracles, I'm back up to 4 Portent, right? And It's not because I want more air in my deck. It's because I need to be able to find the answer immediately, right? And that answer in Miracles just happens to be Terminus. For you in Living Wish, it could be a bunch of different things, right? Because you're based on Beanstalk, and as long as like you have the answer to whatever, you're just going to win, presuming that Beanstalk is churning you cards. So from my POV, I was like, man, I need to find more of what I need when I need it. So I went up back into 4 Portent so I could just find the stuff. I didn't go down the density and anything else. I literally just upped my selection to be able to find it. And that got me on the idea of Living Wish. And I don't know if this is something that other people have ran into in their testing when they're trying to find things, but that's where I got the idea of Living Wish. And maybe there's something else as well that I'm also not thinking of in that space. But
Living Wish,
upping your volume of things.
Living Wish is interesting because I find that the deck that I'm playing, right, the 5-color Draco Bean Packs, links below in Moxfield, right? That deck has a lot of trouble choosing just what to sideboard, right? It's always tough being like, man, okay, like I'm playing against this deck. Do I want to remove? You almost never want to remove Force of Wills, which I find to be weird because a lot of decks that I play, when I'm playing certain matchups, I'm like, okay, Force of Wills are a bad card in this matchup, or I need them. Like it's like I either need the Force of Wills or I like need to side them out and play something that's more targeted to my opponent. That doesn't get me card disadvantage. In this deck, like you just want the Force of Wills because you're like, I'm going to draw a card off of the Force of Will. Anyhow, it's going to be fine, right? And then there's stuff like Orcish Bowmasters is an easy card to decide if you want to side out or not because like sometimes you're just playing a deck that doesn't care about drawing extra cards. There's a couple cards that are like obvious choices in this deck to like throw out. Goblin, Broadside Bombardiers is another one. Like sometimes I don't really need to like win on turn 3. But I find that if I have the option of, let's say I just don't play, so Bowmasters is sort of funny because Bowmasters is a surprise card, right? Like you get people with Bowmasters. But like, let's say I take those Bowmasters out of the main deck and I take those 2 Bombardiers out of the main deck and we play 4 Living Wish, just as a starting point, right? We throw the Bowmasters into the board. We throw, I don't even know that right now I want to play Bombardiers. So, we could put a couple other, we've got what, 3 slots there to throw into the sideboard. I find that my sideboard, if I'm going to play bullets like that, there are cards in my sideboard that can be moved out. Like I don't necessarily maybe need surgical extraction. I can play Bajuka Bog or Endurance or something like that, right? To find those cards. So it comes down to like doing what you were saying, like doing that deck deconstruction where I look at every card and validate whether or not this card needs to be in the deck, especially with this new build I'm trying out, right? If I want to play with Living Wish, then I have to optimize my sideboard for lands and creatures, right? And then you have to think about other things like this is a no for me, but is this a deck that wants to play a card like Cavern of Souls? Cavern of Souls allows me to cast my bullet protected, stuff like that is interesting because, and then Cavern of Souls is a land. I can throw it in my sideboard and be like, in this particular moment where I'm playing into a deck that is going to counter my thing, I can just go get that. Living Wish is rare in that, like, that, and I think what Glittering Wish, right, are the two that have sort of a like wider swath of cards that they can get, right? They can say, okay, I can get a creature or a land. That opens up a lot of design space for you. Glittering Wish, obviously, you need gold card. And I thought about Glittering Wish, too, when we were talking about this initially. I was like, maybe Glittering Wish is where I want to be. But, like, then... So, one of the things that I thought about when I was thinking about that was like, well, I want to be able to side out, like, okay, I'll side out a Draco here. I can always Living Wish it back in if I need it, And so I was like, I like Living Wish because Living Wish allows me to side out cards that I can perceivably get back in a pinch if I need them with Living Wish, right? Maybe side out one Bombardier, right? But I still have access to the other one, or there's one in my board. So in a specific scenario where I'm like, oh yeah, my opponent's dead if I just like do this and this, I have the 5 mana, I win the game, So I thought I went around that design space a little bit while I was messing around. And I think this week I'm going to try, I'll try to do play on Twitch, and invite people to watch my matches, and see how this like Living Wish build does. So I'll put up a link as well to the work in progress of the Living Wish Bean Pack. What do we even call this? It was used to be Draco Bean Pact. Is it Living Draco Bean Pact?
Well,
Living Draco Wish Pact.
I would probably call it like, it's Guild Pack Beanstalk, right? Like that,
Yeah.
that deck sort of explains itself. But I think that the Living Wish experiment is interesting for your deck because more often than not, adding tutors just means that you have tacked on mana to whatever you're doing in a way that is not actually worth the additional mana investment. Yeah. But given that Beanstalk plays so many things that are free and are oftentimes reactive in ways that are important, that just having Living Wish represent Fury, Solitude, Beseiju, Bajuka Bog, Endurance in your board seem like by itself seems a worthwhile inclusion for the fact that it can be any of those things at any point, and that can solve a lot of problems for you. Like if you're getting overwhelmed, you get the Fury. If you need to answer the Magus of the Moon, you get the Solitude. If you need to answer your like a weird permanent on your opponent's side, you can get the Beseiju. You can even like not have to play the Wasteland in the main. You can put that in the board and then have access to a way to like disrupt having a soul so your thing is still on. Like I just think that there's a lot of interesting space where you can move. Like I would love to have something like that to have access to me. I mean, I thought that something that I've experimented with before, and it's close if the power level of the cards was a little bit higher. And that was when I was testing out lessons. I did a lot of testing with lessons where I felt like I needed to have answers for everything that my opponents did at all times, because otherwise I died to it. And that meant that anytime I drew something that wasn't either a way to find an answer or an answer, so if it was my own thing, right? So if it's my own entreat or it's my own triumph or whatever, right? Like that's not disrupting them. That's a win condition on my side. And if my win conditions aren't disruptive, which is why I always find my way back to Jace the Mind Sculptor before I realize that it's been, power crept out.
Yeah.
But Jace can be disruptive while also being a win condition. And like having both of those simultaneously in your control deck is necessary because everything demands an answer. And so I've tested out lessons because I'm like, at least a lesson is a way where it's both disruptive and then can find me a win condition if we're at that stage of the game. The problem is that all those cards are a little bit too pricey, right? Like Divide by Zero.
They're priced for like a slow limited format.
Yeah. I always like, there's a world where I could see them doing, Modern Horizons, and they explore lessons again, and then you get some pushed lesson cards and ways to get the lessons, and like then all of a sudden everybody gets to play with wish boards, right? But I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, in theory, I just like this so much more, where your deck doesn't have any win conditions until you decide to have a win condition, right? Like you don't have to win the game until you're winning, and anything that sort of disrupts that, like. Back when in the 10 years ago or 8 years ago or whatever, and the things that I was watching, it's like, yeah, you could afford to play a couple of win conditions in your control deck because you had time to deploy them, right? Like you could draw a card that didn't matter unless you were winning, because your opponent would play cards that didn't matter that until you had like the Tarmogoyf example, right? Like if they played a 2/3 Tarmogoyf for 2, you're like, great. I can ignore that for a little bit while I like get myself a draw step. That just doesn't exist now. So the idea that you would like back then, it's like, oh, I could trade that 2/3 Tarmogoyf draw for my own win condition, right? Like I can draw a win condition that I can't deploy until later. I can give up that draw step or that card in my deck, that slot in my deck, because it can trade essentially time-wise for the otherwise threat that I don't have to care about. But since that no longer exists, I'm like, well, I can't afford to draw a win condition that doesn't also solve me a problem. And so I was like, well, if all of my things could just become tutors, so I could either tutor for my win condition or the answer, and in which case Beanstalk gets to do it really cleanly because those answers are 0 mana. But then also, if you're incidentally winning the game off Beanstalk because you're loaded up on cards anyway, like that theory actually makes sense to me for Living Wish plus Beanstalk, because it's all 0 mana stuff. So it's 2 mana, answer any of these things, right?
Yeah.
And if you had a 2 mana card that was answer a threat, answer a board, answer a artifact, enchantment, or land, answer, find your own land if you need a land to go up cards, like protective answers to whatever you need. It just seems like so much more viable for what your deck needs or what a control deck needs, without having to like, oh man, I drew this Triumph of St. Catherine and now it's stuck in my hand and I can't actually deploy it. Or oh man,
or like having to waste a brainstorm to make your card work,
right? Or like, oh man, I have this Draco in my opening hand, but I don't have the guild pack, so I'm actually going to need to fetch awkwardly to.
Yeah, that is actually the worst for me. When I have to fetch awkwardly, and then my opponent slams the Blood Moon, and I'm like, oh god, I just played directly into that. All because I had a card in my hand that I wanted to play.
Yeah, and also like one of the advantages now is like every fetch has been errated to say Surveil one on it. Right?
Yeah.
And theoretically, Living Wish could also do that, maybe in an off color that you don't necessarily want to play. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things that you could do with this idea. I mean, the challenge for a tutor package is not getting too in the weeds and getting too cute, right? Like,
yeah. I don't want to be playing Cloud Chaser Eagle.
No, the idea of tutors in control is to make it so that this one card represents a plethora of different answers for a given situation, because in times where you need to have the correct answer at the correct time at all times, right? It's nice that you can be like, okay, I'm going to, tutor for this thing that can answer my opponent's literally whatever they have. And to be able to do that at 2 mana across the board, and then it's with cards that you otherwise would want to play anyway in your board or your main, that I just think that it's a worthwhile example, and something that anybody else who's trying to build a control deck right now, that like, it may be worthwhile to explore that space, because I find that like when I do eventually answer something, if they've already converted enough advantage, it didn't matter that I answered it. I effectively died to it. So you can't let your opponents untap.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting point, Phil. Like I've been watching old episodes of Receivables lately, and one of the things is like putting those old articles into context, right? Like when they talk about like Ice Age, or they talk about like Pro Tour 1996, right? Like they talk about like the showdown in New York or whatnot, and they're talking about looking at these decks through a now lens, like being like, some guy was playing Spectral Bears, and like the only reason for that is because of this, like, and then them being like, if I were to build this deck today with what they had available, it would be this. And like you can just see how like current deck, like there's a difference between like the way we build decks now and the way we used to build decks, right? Like that's what pre-modern is basically all about, right? Like pre-modern is basically like knowing what you know now about, you know, the fullness of the meta too. Like you have a pretty good idea of what the meta looks like, right? In that, knowing what you know now, if you can build a deck with the technology like that exists in 2024 and build this older deck, like what can you get out of it, right? And I think looking at these older articles, going back and saying, okay, yeah, the deck deconstruction, where you like literally look at each card, decide, you know, does this belong here? Why are you playing this deck, this card specifically? You know, giving each deck like a raison d'etre, right? Like being like, I need to know, I'm not just copying a deck list off of Goldfish or Moxfield or something like that, right? Like I'm looking at the top 8 and being like, okay, well they played this because of this. This guy sideboarded Basic Forest because it was the right play, right? Instead of just like, oh, like you have to know that Phil got told he couldn't play Imizawa's Jite, and that was a mistake. You don't just copy the deck list and say, oh yeah, this forest belongs in here, right?
Just always play Basic Forest in your sideboard for the meaning.
Yeah. But that's a perfect example, right? Is like you look at a deck list and you ask like, why is this here? Why is that here? Like anybody looking at my deck right now would look at it and be like, well, what broadside bombardiers in here for? And then you see Draco and you immediately go, oh, okay, that's cute, because there's not a lot else that you want to do. And also there's this new card, some new squirrel or raccoon or something that like animates your 4 mana or more enchantments or artifacts. And that looks interesting because that makes my guild packs guys.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, so that's and my like leyline bindings guys too, right? So I got to remember what that card is. It's some sort of raccoon, but someone was messing around with that in like an 80 card Urion deck, and I was like, ooh, that's actually something I might like kind of look at, like, yeah, throw that down and just start attacking with 4/4 guild packs. Is kind of hot.
So reminding me of something else that we talked about before hopping on here, which is how control decks really now need to have a versatility of answers, a versatility of answers on hand more effectively than before, right? Like that seems to only be that trajectory seems to only be increasing, right? Like the need to have the exact correct answer at the time that you need it is really important because the time in which that you are effectively dead is so much faster. So one of the cards that I don't know if we talked too deeply about that I've been thinking more and more about that has in my head just become more and more reasonable of a card that like might see worth fringe play at least is Paw Patch Formation, which is from Bloomborough.
Okay.
And it's 1 and a green and it's modal, right? So you can either destroy an enchantment, destroy a creature with flying, or draw a card and make a food. Now, the reason why I think that is a more versatile answer for a bunch of different things is it's removal for a bunch of different things, right? So it condenses your cards, but against the top decks in the format, or at least the top pillars in the format, right? At the very least, it replaces itself and gains you life, right? So I get that it does it over 2 mana and 2 mana to gain that life, but it represents life gain in your deck, and it comes at the cost of cycling it, right?
Yeah.
But the alternative is having this main board answer to Urza Saga, Leyline Binding, Beanstalk, any of the creatures in Delver, particularly Murktide. If you put something in the way and they try and jump their frog, they now have to consider whether or not they can jump their frog if you are holding up mana. If they don't, you are able to gain life and cycle. Like it's not good, right? Like the card's not good.
I'll tell you, nothing hurts more in your life than when Psychic Frog jumps and then your opponent kills it because it's flying.
Yeah, I just think that like at the very least you're going to have plenty of other targets against that deck.
Yeah.
And against if you're not playing against that
That's
deck,
almost every deck, right? Like,
yeah, of course. And if you're not playing against that deck, you're playing against Urza Saga or Beanstalk, in which
Yeah.
case having just a additional
it's almost never dead. Yeah.
is really important, right? So the fact that the way that the pillars of the format are set right now, that card seems like it would be a lot better for a control deck that just needs to have whatever answer it needs at the time. And if you're like, man, my opponent has a Delver that they're about to flip, and I really don't want to take too much damage from that. Or you're like, oh, well, they played Urza Saga. I would really love to have an answer to that. Like the fact that you can have both of that card, essentially it's pick your poison, but it can cycle, right? Yeah. And that seems pretty good for a deck that needs to have access to those kinds of tools. Again, it's like one of those things where I'm like, man, why does green get it? I could really use something like that. But all that is to say that there are a couple different things that I've noticed in the last couple of weeks, not having to think about because the format's lame duck because of grief. Instead of thinking about like how to attack this format because grief is going to go, so we're in a lame duck format. I'm thinking more about like, okay, what does the format after grief goes actually look like? And the pillars of the format that we've talked about many a time are still going to stand, right? You're going to have Daze Wasteland, you're going to have Urza Saga, you're going to have Beanstalk, and then you're going to have Dark Ritual. And I don't think that means that the tools that are going to be necessary, everything that we talked up into this point, the rationale for trying a Living Wish package is going to change. I think that's all going to be the same. There's just going to be a few, there are going to be fewer non-games because grief won't be around. Coming back around to what that means, though, is it's making me think, okay, what does the format actually require? And it requires you having the answer at all times, meaning that the win conditions that you can't play, what are the bottlenecks? And I think the bottlenecks are mana, right?
Yeah.
It's just straight up actually getting above. We've talked about it a bunch of times, but like the combination between Daze Wasteland and all of the threats that snowball, and Urza Saga making it so that you can't actually let them do anything because otherwise they just chunk you, or Beanstalk making it so that you're effectively buried before you can get off the ground. It means that the thing that you don't get is time to develop, which means hitting your land drops and then actually progressing the game.
Yeah.
So you have to trade. What you can do, though, is that if you can offset the need for mana, i.e. getting through development. So in Beanstalk, it's a classic example here of this idea. You're playing Beanstalk, which stops at 2. Your curve stops at 2. Even though you're playing all these 5 drops, they're all effectively 0 mana, right?
Yeah.
So you are conceding the fact that you don't need to develop, and you can still play this deck that wants to grind because all of your shit is free past Beanstalk.
Yeah. Or
it's 2 mana or less, right? So you are abiding by the concession of the format, which is that you can't play 3 drops effectively without an Ancient Tomb. Okay, if that's where we are, what card choices actually make sense in that space? I.e., the Living Wish idea, because that's 2 mana for all of the 0 mana stuff. The curve still stops at 2. And then in my space, the thing that I've been testing out, and this is just theory crafting, but this is something that I'm hoping like maybe other people hear it and then translate their own ideas because they've been thinking in the space and this helps them articulate it. I've been thinking like, man, I would really like to play. I've been trying like Triumph, which requires setup, or Entreat the Angels, which means that I actually have to get through development, which means that I've effectively won the game anyway. Or I'm trying to play Jace the Mind Sculptor, which is power crept out, or any other Planeswalker because you can't play any 3 mana spells because you just get bodied. So where I've turned to is, okay, what are the cards that don't require mana? They just require time. Now, there's a difference when I say development and time to develop. If development just means time, but not mana, right? If every land that I draw past development time, which would be, the 2 to 4 range, every land past that is a concession to the Daze Wasteland decks because they don't need that. Every land you pass past that, you've drawn them a card, right? And they're already better at outcarding you because they have all these snowbally cards that are just better than everything that you're doing now. And so the space that I've got to, granted, I also don't think it's good, but the theory I think behind it is worthwhile discussing. The thing that I've got to is Luminarch Ascension. We're going to bring that card up on screen.
Luminarch Ascension, yeah.
So this is where
EDH staple.
EDH staple. This is the type of card that is just representative of this idea of not like if you can get through with your answers, a la all of your free spells or any or whatever, and the thing that you're trading to get through development is not time for mana, it's time in general. Yeah. I just need time. I don't need to develop past X number of lands. then this card is not asking you for mana. This card is asking you for time. And so if you can offset the fact that you're going to trade cards for time rather than trade cards for land drops, which means that you need to play some amount of card advantage. And we have talked a bunch on the cast where I'm like, yeah, cards that simply draw cards and nothing else, if they're not an engine a la Beanstalk, it's 2 mana, draw 12 over the course of a game. If it's not something that's a clear design mistake, then it's not playable anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Gone are the days of predict, gone are the days of anything that doesn't incidentally draw cards or is its own engine. So in this regard, this is 2 mana and then doesn't ask you for any mana. It just asks you for time. So every brainstorm I have, every ponder I have, everything doesn't have to look for land drops. It only has to look for answers. And if I'm trading those cards for answers as opposed to cards for land drops and development, then this card becomes a lot more appealing because that's the world that we're in. Does this all make sense?
No, that does make sense. It's an interesting thought because that's a card that I look at and I go, I don't know. I wouldn't want to play that.
I'm not defending the card. I'm defending what it represents in terms of the theory of what it is now. You know, at least how it feels to me now.
No, that's what I'm saying. That theory makes this card slightly more appetizing, which is interesting.
Like this is a card where because we've talked about before where it's like the format is so fast that to play a bunch of basics to get through Wasteland is just untenable anymore, because if you can't cast the cards you need in the time that you cast them, and you just have unspent mana because they're basics and can't actually deploy what you need when you need them,
you time walk yourself.
Just like the format is sped up and the threats are so good that you need to answer them so immediately that if you don't have access to be able to cast what you need when you need to, you effectively time walk yourself and lose, right? And you did that because of a concession that you made to one of the compressors of the format, which is Daze and Wasteland. So the way to offset that we've talked about is just overload those cards, right? How about I just play more non-basics and then just assume that I'm going to get Wastelanded and have to play through it? In which case, I'm conceding that I have to compress my curve down because I can't afford. If I can afford to get Wastelanded, it means that I have to keep my curve below 2.
Exactly.
This is a card right? You know what I'm saying? Like that's really more so where my headspace is. And I'm sure there are a bunch of cards that I'm not thinking of because I only think of the miracle space that other people maybe could think like that come to mind now that I would love to hear about, right? This is sort of new in the space of all this time I've been like, you got to compress your curve, but I've never thought about changing, okay, what are the rules of development? We've always thought that time to develop means land drops. But if time to develop just means actual factual time, right? This card is asking you for 4 end steps, right? It's not asking you for mana, it's just asking you for 4 end steps. And in that 4th end step, if you can get that last counter on it, then you can you can just sink your mana into making angels, untap, and then attack, right?
Yeah.
But it's not asking you for anything beyond time. So if development no longer means land drops, it just means time, that's a whole new paradigm that we could look at and a whole new slew of cards that we may not have looked at otherwise because there were just better options. Or at the time, like thicker options that just made more sense, a la Entreat versus Luminarch Ascension, right? It sounds comical to talk about these individual cards specifically, but I think the theory makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, it's a super interesting point. Because if you're gonna fight those tempo decks, like you're gonna need to make those concessions. So I think that's actually a pretty salient point. Since we're running out of time, I want to real quick just shout out the card that I was talking about before. It's called Bello, Bard of the Brambles. It's 1 a green and a red for a 3/3 legendary raccoon. During your turn, each non-equipment artifact and or non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater is a 4/4 creature in addition to its other types and has indestructible and has whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. That's a lot of text, Phil.
That's too much text. You had to take 3 breaths in between that one.
That is just a 4/4? Great. Oh, it's indestructible? Okay. Oh, it has Thieving Magpie's ability on top of that? That's actually pretty good. Like, I was like, 3/3 that, like, makes your guys a 4/4, like, you slam that, and you're like, I guess I attacked you. Dude, that, like, gets you back into the game.
You reading that card just made me think of a post on Twitter I saw. I wish I remembered who it was. I think I sent it to you, maybe we can find it. But it was literally like, somebody was complaining about, like, you know, why are these cards played or whatever, like these cards suck, like I always hate playing against these cards. And then somebody commented on it against all those hate cards and was like, yeah, I have to play them because you keep putting shit Farticus the exponential in your
Yeah, in the command zone.
I was like, every card is really
So all those cards were like Song of the Dryad. It's all like cards that keep your commander on the board, but like remove its text.
So that it can't-
transformation, so that your opponent like can't like just replay it. Which is a real hateful thing to do in regular EDH and CDH. It's just like everyone does that. But yeah, no, that's a perfect example, actually.
There you go. This whole new theory. I'm going to call this the Shitfarticus the exponential theory.
Shitfarticus the exponential. It's great.
Is everybody's going to be playing Shitfarticus the exponentials. Then you need to like compress your time to be able to figure out how to answer all of it.
Well, with that said, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We have a ton of new people that just joined our Patreon. I will have a list of those people to read off next week. If you want to be included on that list, this is a great time to add yourself to the list. For the low cost of $5, you get ad-free content, and you also get bonus content that we create for you every month. Phil is going to be working on his part of the Daze and Tomb, Urza Saga and Ancient Tomb debate. Mine are already ready, but I have to finish editing them with Phil, and we'll have that up, and that's gonna be like four episodes of just like fun content where we like debate whether or not these cards are should be banned or not, which will be I think a lot of fun. But with that said, thank you everybody for watching, and we will catch you later on this week. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.